Miss Marple and Lady Bantry's secret room behind the bookcase. Welcome, dear friends, to Warm Pages. I'm your host, Edward, and I cannot tell you how much joy it brings me to know you choose to spend your evenings with these stories. Each tale takes time and love to prepare, but your kindness and the way our little community grows make it all so meaningful. Thank you for being such a wonderful audience. If you haven't yet, do subscribe so you never miss a new mystery. Now, let's gently turn the page and begin tonight's story. Chapter 1, The Bookcase Slides. The morning air at Gossington Hall carried the peculiar mixture of dust, wood shavings, and old leather that accompanies any disturbance of a well-established library. Lady Bantry stood in the doorway, surveying the chaos with the sort of pleased satisfaction that comes from watching one's long-held secrets finally revealed to the world. "Really, Dolly," said Miss Marple, carefully stepping over a pile of leather-bound volumes, "I had no idea you were harbouring such mysteries behind your bookshelves." Lady Bantry laughed, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Oh, my dear Jane, you haven't seen anything yet. Guy assures me that what we're about to discover will be absolutely thrilling." Guy Skeffington, the elegant architect who had been overseeing the library restoration, looked up from where he was examining the wall behind the relocated books. His movements were precise, almost ritualistic, as he ran his hands along the oak panelling. Everything about him spoke of careful attention to detail, from his immaculately pressed shirt to the way he arranged his tools in perfect parallel lines. "The workmen have done exactly as I instructed," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being listened to. "The books from this section have been moved safely, and now we can properly examine what your ancestors saw fit to conceal." Mrs. Hart, the housekeeper, sniffed disapprovingly from her position near the door. "All this dust and disruption," she muttered, "and just when I'd got the library properly cleaned for autumn." "Oh, don't be such a spoil-sport, Mrs. Hart," said a crisp voice from behind Miss Marple. Crispin Vale stepped into the room with the confident stride of a man who made his living from other people's secrets. The London author was impeccably dressed, though there was something in his sharp eyes that suggested he saw everything and forgot nothing. This is exactly the sort of thing my readers adore. Hidden rooms, family secrets, the romance of the past suddenly made tangible. He pulled out a small notebook and began scribbling. "I do hope you won't mind if I include this in my book on hidden rooms, Lady Bantry. The public has such an appetite for this sort of thing." "As long as you're flattering about the house," Lady Bantry replied with a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. Ianthe Lacey, Lady Bantry's young companion, moved quietly through the room, her clever fingers already beginning to arrange the displaced volumes with an eye for both order and beauty. She was a pale, thoughtful girl who seemed to notice everything while saying very little. "Mr. Skeffington," she said softly, "shall I help steady the books while you work? Some of these older bindings look rather fragile." "Most kind of you, Miss Lacey." Skeffington's smile was professional, courteous. "Though I think we're ready for our little demonstration now." Edgar Sims, the butler, appeared silently in the doorway as if summoned by some invisible signal. He was a man who moved like smoke through the house, appearing where needed, disappearing when not required. His hands, Miss Marple noticed, were stained faintly with what looked like paste or glue. "Are we ready for the revelation, my lady?" he asked in his soft voice. "Oh yes, Edgar." Everyone gathered round. Lady Bantry clapped her hands together like a child about to unveil a birthday surprise. "Now, Guy, show them our family secret." Skeffington moved to a section of shelving that looked identical to all the rest. His fingers found a particular volume, Lives of the Saints, Volume 7, and tilted it slightly. Then, with practised ease, he pressed something behind a copy of Plutarch's Lives. For a moment nothing happened. Then, with a soft grinding noise that spoke of old mechanisms and hidden springs, an entire section of the bookcase began to swing inward. "Good heavens!" exclaimed Dr. Haydock, who had arrived just in time to witness the demonstration. "It's like something out of a Gothic novel." Behind the false bookcase lay revealed a narrow space, barely large enough for a person to stand upright. The walls were of ancient oak, dark with age, and there was a simple three-legged stool positioned before a small niche carved into the far wall. Near the floor, a small grille provided what must once have been ventilation into the adjoining room. "A priest's hole," breathed Crispin Vale, his eyes alight with professional excitement. "Stuart era, I'd say, judging by the workmanship. How absolutely marvellous! The Catholics must have used it during the persecutions." "So the family story said," Lady Bantry confirmed, "though by the time I was a child it was just a romantic tale. I never dreamed it was actually real." Miss Marple stepped closer to examine the hidden chamber. The air that drifted out was stale and close, carrying the scent of old wood and something else, something that made her think of churches and candle wax. "The mechanism is quite ingenious," Skeffington was explaining to the assembled company. "The spring-loaded latch inside ensures that once closed, the door can only be opened from the outside, using the proper combination of books. A person could hide inside and pull the door closed, but they would need assistance to get out again." "How perfectly dreadful," said Griselda Clement, the vicar's wife, who had arrived with her husband just as the demonstration began. "Imagine being trapped in there." "Oh, but that was rather the point," Vale said, still scribbling in his notebook. "Better trapped alive than caught and executed, I should think." Inspector Slack, who had been standing quietly in the corner looking sceptical about the whole proceedings, stepped forward for a closer look. "Seems like a dangerous sort of hiding place to me. What if whoever was supposed to let you out didn't come back?" "Now don't be so gloomy, Inspector," Lady Bantry chided. "We're not living in Stuart times. No one's going to get locked in there now." Vale peered into the narrow space with obvious fascination. "I don't suppose I could just step inside for a moment. For research purposes, you understand. I'd like to get a sense of the proportions, perhaps take a few measurements." "Oh, I don't see why not," Lady Bantry said, "though mind the step down. And do be careful not to touch anything that might be fragile." "Perhaps this evening after dinner," Skeffington suggested smoothly. "The light will be better then, and we'll have more time to examine the space properly." Miss Marple found herself studying the faces around her. There was something in the quality of attention each person was paying to the hidden room that struck her as significant, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. The afternoon passed pleasantly enough, with much discussion of the historical significance of the discovery and speculation about who might have used the hiding place and when. By evening the excitement had settled into a more scholarly curiosity. After a quiet dinner, Vale approached his hostess. "Lady Bantry, if I might impose on your kindness, I'd very much like to spend just 5 minutes in that priest's hole. For my research, you understand. I need to get accurate measurements of the niche." "Of course, my dear fellow. Guy, would you be so kind as to show Mr. Vale the mechanism once more?" It was just past 10 o'clock when Edgar Sims began his nightly routine of securing the house. He moved through the rooms with his characteristic silent efficiency, checking windows, drawing curtains, ensuring that all was as it should be for the night. When he reached the library, he found the bookcase standing closed, looking perfectly ordinary in the soft lamplight. Lady Bantry had long since retired, and the house had settled into the peaceful quiet of a country evening, but something made him pause. Perhaps it was the quality of the silence, or perhaps it was the butler's instinct for anything out of place in a well-ordered household. "Lady Bantry," he called softly up the stairs, "I think you should come down to the library." When she appeared, wrapped in her dressing gown and looking concerned, Edgar gestured toward the bookcase. "Mr. Vale asked for 5 minutes to take his measurements, my lady. That was 20 minutes ago." Lady Bantry moved to the bookcase and performed the little ritual Skeffington had demonstrated. She tilted Lives of the Saints, Volume 7, pressed the hidden spring behind Plutarch, and stepped back as the mechanism engaged. The bookcase swung open to reveal Crispin Vale slumped forward on the three-legged stool, his head resting against the carved niche. The small candle he had brought with him lay extinguished on the floor. He was quite dead. Dr. Haydock, summoned hastily from his own fireside, knelt in the narrow space and made his examination by the light of Edgar's torch. "Heart, I should say," he pronounced after several minutes. "The excitement, perhaps, combined with the close air. Not enough ventilation in a space like this. He emerged from the priest's hole, brushing dust from his knees. The spring latch was engaged from inside. No sign of any struggle or violence. Miss Marple, who had been awakened by the commotion, and had come down in her warm woolly dressing gown, stood quietly observing, while the others clustered around the entrance to the hidden chamber, discussing the tragedy in hushed voices. She moved closer to the bookcase itself. Bending slightly, she ran one gloved finger along the top edges of the books that formed the secret mechanism. On 3 volumes, she found what she was looking for, a faint smear of something that felt tacky to the touch, something with the smooth texture of wheat starch paste. Then, kneeling carefully beside the base of the bookcase where it pivoted, she picked up 2 pale fibres that had caught on the skirting board. They were flat and starched, not at all like wool or cotton, and they gleamed faintly in the lamplight. She said nothing about her discoveries to the others, not yet. But as she helped Lady Bantry back to her room and settled the house for what remained of the night, Miss Marple found herself thinking about paste and fibres, about secret mechanisms and the people who understand how they work. In her experience, when someone died in a locked room, it was rarely as simple as it appeared. Chapter 2. A Room Latched Within. The morning brought with it the peculiar atmosphere that settles over a house where sudden death has occurred. Inspector Slack arrived early, his heavy footsteps echoing through the normally peaceful halls of Gossington Hall as he went about the business of sealing the library with official yellow tape and stern warnings about disturbing evidence. Miss Marple found Lady Bantry in the morning room, pale but composed, receiving the sympathetic calls of neighbours who had heard the news with that mixture of genuine concern and barely concealed curiosity that such events inevitably produce. "Such a shock, my dear," Mrs. Price Ridley was saying as she settled herself more comfortably in her chair. "And such an unusual way to go. One doesn't expect these old hiding places to be quite so dangerous." "The inspector seems to think it's perfectly straightforward," Lady Bantry replied, though her voice lacked its usual confident ring. Poor Mr. Vale's heart simply gave out in that stuffy little space. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea from Edgar Sims, noting how the butler's usually steady hands showed the faintest tremor as he poured. The events of the previous evening had clearly affected the entire household. "If I may ask, Lady Bantry," Miss Marple said gently, "who among your guests last night knew the secret of opening the bookcase?" "Why, only Guy Skeffington and myself," Lady Bantry replied promptly. "It's been a family secret for generations, you know. My late husband showed me years ago, but we rarely spoke of it. I told Guy when he began the restoration work, naturally, since he needed to know about any hidden mechanisms that might affect the structural work." "And Mr. Sims?" Miss Marple inquired, glancing toward the butler who was quietly arranging some papers on a side table. Edgar straightened, his soft voice carrying just a hint of defensiveness. "I learnt the mechanism only yesterday evening, miss, when Mr. Skeffington demonstrated it. 5 minutes before the tragedy, I should say." Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward eagerly. "But surely the door could have been opened from inside. I mean, if poor Mr. Vale had felt unwell, couldn't he have simply let himself out?" "That's just it," Lady Bantry said, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. "The mechanism only works from outside. It's a spring latch that clicks shut automatically once the door closes. The person inside would be completely dependent on someone else to release them." Miss Marple set down her teacup thoughtfully. Most ingenious from a historical perspective, though rather alarming from a modern one. And Inspector Slack found no evidence of the latch having been tampered with? "None whatsoever," came the inspector's gruff voice from the doorway. He entered without ceremony, his notebook in hand and his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. The mechanism worked exactly as it should. No signs of force anywhere. The dust on the floor of that little room shows only one set of footprints, and they match Mr. Vale's shoes perfectly. He settled his considerable bulk into a chair that creaked ominously under his weight. "I've had a word with Dr. Haydock this morning. He's satisfied it was heart failure brought on by excitement and poor air circulation. The coroner will likely record natural causes." "Then the matter is closed?" Lady Bantry asked, though something in her tone suggested she was not entirely convinced. As far as I'm concerned, yes, Slack replied firmly, though I'll need to speak with everyone who was present yesterday, just for the formality of it. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, ostensibly to admire the garden, but actually to collect her thoughts. Through the glass she could see Guy Skeffington walking across the lawn with his measured, precise stride, his architect's portfolio tucked neatly under his arm. "Inspector," she said, turning back to the room, "I wonder if you've had occasion to examine the room adjacent to the library. The china closet, I believe." Slack looked up from his notebook with mild irritation. The china closet? What would that have to do with anything? "Oh, nothing important, I'm sure," Miss Marple replied in her most innocent tone. "It's just that the little ventilation grill connects the two rooms, doesn't it? I noticed yesterday that there seemed to be some work being done in there as well." Mrs. Hart, who had been dusting the morning room mantelpiece with unusual vigour, paused in her work. "Plumbers," she said, with the sort of dark satisfaction that housekeepers reserve for discussing the failings of workmen. "Always leaving their mess behind. Screws all over the floor in there, and the panel behind the lower shelves all askew." "Plumbers?" Inspector Slack's interest was suddenly engaged. "What plumbers?" "The ones Mr. Skeffington brought in last week," Mrs. Hart replied. "Something about checking the old pipes behind the wall panelling. They were in and out of that china closet for the better part of 2 days, moving the good china about and leaving everything in a proper state." Miss Marple and the inspector exchanged glances. Without another word they made their way to the china closet, a small room lined with glass-fronted cabinets containing Lady Bantry's collection of antique porcelain. The lower shelves had indeed been disturbed. Behind them, a wooden panel hung slightly ajar, revealing the dark space between the walls where pipes and wiring ran through the old house. The screws that should have held it firmly in place lay scattered on the floor, and Miss Marple noticed at once that they had been rubbed with something that looked like soap to make them turn silently. "Now that's interesting," muttered Inspector Slack, kneeling to examine the panel more closely. "These screws have been recently disturbed, but they're clean as a whistle. No rust, no struggle to remove them." Miss Marple bent to pick up something from the floor near the baseboard. It was a small crumb of what appeared to be whiting powder, and beside it lay a short piece of thread, flat and starched, with one end slightly frayed as if it had been rubbed against something rough. The ventilation grill between the china closet and the priest's hole was set low in the wall, about 18 inches from the floor. Miss Marple knelt beside it and examined the metal bars carefully. 2 of them, at approximately neck height to someone seated on the other side, showed signs of recent polishing, a faint gleam that stood out against the general patina of age. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I think you might want to have another look at that priest's hole." When they returned to the library, Slack carefully removed the yellow tape and operated the mechanism to open the bookcase once more. The narrow chamber beyond looked exactly as it had the night before, except that now the morning light streaming through the china closet grill created a small pattern of shadows on the opposite wall. "The candle," Miss Marple observed, pointing to where the stub of wax lay on the floor. "Dr. Haydock mentioned that it had burned out. But look at the grill, Inspector. There's no soot mark on the metal where the smoke would naturally have been drawn toward the ventilation." Slack squinted at the grill, then at the candle. "What are you getting at, Miss Marple?" "Only that if the ventilation had been working properly, one would expect to see some evidence of the candle smoke being drawn toward the fresh air. The absence of such marks suggests that the airflow was blocked, perhaps deliberately." They returned to the china closet, where Miss Marple asked Lady Bantry to open and close the door several times, while she held a feather near the grill opening. The feather remained perfectly still. "No draught at all," she murmured. "And yet there should be, shouldn't there, with the door creating air movement in here." Her eye fell on something else, a small square of fresh polish on the edge of one of the china closet shelves, precisely positioned where a board of the right size could have been placed to cover the grill opening. Inspector Slack was beginning to look less certain about his natural causes theory. "You're suggesting someone deliberately blocked the ventilation?" "I'm not suggesting anything definite," Miss Marple replied mildly. "But I do think it might be worth having another word with everyone who was in the house last evening." particularly those who might have had occasion to visit the china closet. As they left the room, Miss Marple noticed Guy Skeffington approaching the house, his portfolio still under his arm, and his expression one of professional concern mixed with what might have been anxiety. "Ah, Skeffington," Inspector Slack called out as they met in the hallway. "I'd like a word with you about these plumbers you brought in last week." The architect's face showed nothing but polite cooperation, but Miss Marple caught the slightest hesitation before he replied. "Of course, Inspector. Though I'm not sure what bearing that might have on poor Mr. Vale's unfortunate accident." "Probably none at all," Slack said heavily, "but in cases like this we like to be thorough." Miss Marple said nothing, but she was beginning to think that thoroughness was going to be very important indeed. Chapter 3, Miss Marple Notices Paste. The afternoon sun slanted through the library windows as Miss Marple stood before the bookcase, her keen eyes studying the volumes that concealed the secret mechanism. Inspector Slack watched with barely concealed impatience as she examined each book with the methodical precision of a botanist cataloguing specimens. "Lives of the Saints, Volume 7, she murmured, running her finger along the top edge of the leather binding. The handle book, as Mr. Skeffington called it. Her fingertip came away with a faint residue that she examined carefully. It was tacky to the touch, with a peculiar smoothness that comes from wheat starch mixed with paste, the sort used in bookbinding and repair work. "Most curious," she said, more to herself than to the inspector. "One would expect dust to accumulate on these upper edges, undisturbed for years. Instead, we find fresh paste." She moved to the adjacent volumes, those that Skeffington had manipulated during his demonstration the previous day. 2 more showed similar traces of the sticky substance, applied so recently that it had not yet dried completely. "What's the significance of paste on books?" Slack demanded. "Surely that's normal enough in a library." "Oh, quite normal for books being repaired," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "But these volumes show no signs of recent restoration work. The paste appears to have been applied only to the top edges, where someone with gluey fingers might have handled them." From across the room came the soft sound of Edgar Sims arranging papers at a small work table near the window. Miss Marple approached him with her characteristic gentle smile. "Mr. Sims, I hope you don't mind my curiosity, but I notice you have quite an elaborate setup for book maintenance." The butler looked up from his work, his pale eyes showing a flicker of pride. "Indeed, miss. Lady Bantry has always been particular about the care of her books. I take responsibility for minor repairs, relabelling and such tasks." Miss Marple examined the table with genuine interest. Small pots of wheat paste stood in neat rows, alongside brushes of various sizes, strips of paper for labels, and bottles of whiting powder for cleaning leather bindings. The equipment spoke of careful attention to detail and long experience. "How admirable," she said, "and you use wheat paste, I see. Much superior to the chemical adhesives one finds nowadays." "Oh yes, miss. The old methods are always best for old books. Wheat paste can be removed if necessary, unlike those modern glues that damage the bindings permanently." Miss Marple picked up one of the freshly prepared labels, noting how precisely it had been cut and how evenly the paste had been applied to its back. "You obviously take great care with your work, Mr. Sims. No smudges or waste." "I pride myself on neatness, miss." She glanced at his hands, which were indeed immaculate, then at the row of labels drying on a piece of blotting paper. Each one was perfect, with no excess paste around the edges, no fingerprints or smears. "I wonder," she said thoughtfully, "if you happen to notice whether anyone else might have had occasion to handle books yesterday evening?" "After the demonstration, I mean." Edgar considered this carefully. "Well, miss, Mr. Vale was quite interested in the older volumes. I saw him examining several of them during the afternoon, taking notes in that little book of his. And Mr. Skeffington, of course, was moving books about as part of his work." "Did you notice anything unusual about Mr. Vale's appearance when you found him last night? His clothing, perhaps?" The butler's brow furrowed with concentration. "Now that you mention it, miss, there was something. His right cuff had a dusting of white powder on it. I noticed because he was usually so particular about his dress." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "White powder. the same colour as the whiting used for cleaning book bindings. She moved to where Crispin Vale's jacket still hung on a chair, awaiting collection by the undertaker. The right cuff indeed showed traces of fine white powder, ground into the fabric as if from repeated contact. "Inspector," she called softly, "I think you might find this interesting." Slack joined her, squinting at the almost invisible traces on the dark fabric. "What am I looking at?" "Whiting powder, I believe, the same substance used for cleaning and preparing book bindings. But notice how it's worked into the fibres, as if Mr. Vale had been in contact with freshly prepared binding materials for some time." She returned to Edgar's work table and examined the arrangement more closely. The wheat paste in its small pot showed no signs of having been used recently. The surface was smooth and undisturbed, with no fingerprints or tool marks around the edges. The labels waiting to dry were in various stages of completion, but all showed the same meticulous craftsmanship. "Mr. Sims," she said gently, "when did you last use your wheat paste?" "Yesterday morning, miss. I prepared a batch of spine labels for some volumes that needed attention. I always make more than I need, as it keeps well if covered properly." Miss Marple lifted the lid of the paste pot and peered inside. The surface was indeed smooth and undisturbed, but around the rim she found something interesting. Several spots where paste had been scraped away, leaving small gouges in the otherwise perfect surface. "Someone has helped themselves to your paste, Mr. Sims." "Rather recently, I should say." The butler looked genuinely puzzled. "That's most unusual, miss. I always keep my supplies well organised, and I would certainly have noticed if anyone had disturbed them." "Unless," Miss Marple suggested quietly, "it happened while you were occupied elsewhere." During the evening, perhaps, when the household was settling for the night, Inspector Slack was beginning to show more interest in the proceedings. "You're suggesting someone deliberately took paste from this table? For what purpose?" "That remains to be determined," Miss Marple replied. "But consider this. We have fresh paste on the mechanism books, whiting powder on Mr. Vale's cuff, and evidence that someone accessed Mr. Sims's supplies without his knowledge. Someone who knew exactly where to find what they needed." She moved back to the bookcase and examined the Lives of the Saints, Volume 7, once more, this time using a handkerchief to protect her fingers as she tilted the book slightly. "The paste is applied not just to the top edge, but along this spine where one would naturally grip the volume. See here, Inspector? These fingerprint impressions in the tacky substance?" Slack squinted at the book. "I can't make out any clear prints." "No, but you can see the pattern of disturbance. Someone with paste on their fingers handled this book after the paste was applied. Someone who knew precisely how to manipulate the mechanism." She straightened up, her mild blue eyes thoughtful. "I think we must ask ourselves why someone would need to handle these books with paste-covered fingers. What purpose could it serve?" Guy Skeffington appeared in the doorway at that moment, his architectural portfolio under his arm, and his expression one of professional concern. "I do hope I'm not intruding," he said courteously. "I've come to collect some measurements I left behind yesterday. I trust the investigation is proceeding smoothly." Miss Marple observed him with interest as he moved toward a side table, where several rolled papers lay waiting. His movements were precise as always, each gesture calculated and economical. "Mr. Skeffington," she said pleasantly, "I wonder if you might help us with a small puzzle. Someone appears to have used Mr. Sim's wheat paste last evening, but we can't determine who or why." Skeffington paused in gathering his papers. "Wheat paste? How odd! I can't imagine why anyone would need such a thing." "Unless," Miss Marple suggested gently, "they were engaged in some sort of book-binding or repair work. You wouldn't happen to carry such supplies yourself, would you? For your restoration projects?" "Occasionally," he admitted, "though I prefer to use the materials available on site when possible. Less to carry about, you understand." Miss Marple smiled her gentle smile, but her eyes remained sharp as they studied the architect's face. In her long experience, it was often the smallest details that reveal the largest truths. And wheat paste, she was beginning to suspect, was going to prove very revealing indeed. Chapter 4, the dummy volume. It was Ianthe Lacey who first drew attention to the anomaly. The young woman had spent the morning quietly reorganizing the displaced books, her delicate fingers handling each volume with the reverence due to old and precious things. She paused beside the bookcase mechanism, holding a leather-bound tome that seemed somehow wrong in her hands. "Lady Bantry," she said softly, "I think there's something peculiar about this naval chronicle." Miss Marple looked up from her contemplation of the paste evidence, immediately alert to the note of puzzlement in the girl's voice. Lady Bantry, who had been discussing arrangements with Inspector Slack, turned with mild curiosity. "What sort of peculiarity, my dear?" Ianthe held up the volume in question. "Naval Chronicle 1806, she read from the spine. "But it's far too light. A book this size should weigh considerably more." She offered it to Miss Marple, who accepted it with interest. The moment she took it in her hands, she understood Ianthe's concern. The volume felt hollow, lacking the substantial heft that one expected from a genuine book of that period. "Most observant of you, Miss Lacey," Miss Marple said warmly. "May I?" She opened the cover with careful fingers, and immediately saw that her suspicions were correct. The book was indeed hollow, its pages having been cut away to create a hidden compartment. Nestled inside was a coil of flat linen tape, the sort used in fine bookbinding, wound around a small brass curtain ring that gleamed dully in the afternoon light. "Good heavens," breathed Lady Bantry, "what on earth is that doing there?" Inspector Slack crowded closer, his heavy features showing keen interest for the first time that day. "Let me see that." Miss Marple handed over the volume, but not before she had noticed something else tucked into the back of the hollow space. With delicate fingers, she extracted a fragment of paper that had been torn from something larger. "A book plate," she observed, examining the elegant script. "Ex Libris Gossington Hall." But the paper was smeared with what appeared to be the same wheat paste they had found on the mechanism books, as if it had been hastily removed from one volume and incompletely reattached to another. Lady Bantry's face flushed with indignation. "Vandalism in my library! Who would dare to hollow out a perfectly good book and damage the book plates?" Guy Skeffington, who had remained silent during this discovery, stepped forward with what appeared to be theatrical concern. "How extraordinary! I can't imagine what purpose such modifications could serve." Miss Marple studied his face carefully as he spoke, noting the precise way he arranged his features into an expression of surprise. Everything about the man was calculated, from his perfectly pressed clothes to his measured speech patterns. "The tape is quite interesting," she observed, lifting one end of the linen coil with a fingernail. "Bookbinder's tape, unless I'm much mistaken. Flat, strong, and treated with starch to give it body." She held it up to the light, and the material had the distinctive sheen that came from proper preparation. The end was finished with a small, neat knot, tied with the sort of precision that spoke of professional training. "I've seen similar tape in restoration work," Skeffington said smoothly. "It's used for reinforcing bindings and creating temporary supports during repair processes." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "and this particular piece appears to have been prepared quite recently. The starch treatment is still flexible, not brittle as it would become with age." Inspector Slack was examining the brass ring with professional thoroughness. What would someone want with a ring attached to bookbinding tape? Perhaps it was meant to make the tape easier to retrieve from some confined space, Miss Marple suggested gently. The ring would allow one to pull the tape through a narrow opening without losing one's grip. She moved closer to examine the bookcase mechanism once more, her eyes following the lines of the woodwork with new understanding. The position of the hollow book was significant, she realized. It stood directly beside the hinge point of the secret door, close enough to the mechanism that someone working there could easily have access to its contents. "Miss Lacey," she said thoughtfully, "when you were organising the books this morning, did you notice any other volumes that seemed out of place or damaged?" The young woman considered carefully. Several of the older books showed signs of recent handling, fingerprints in the dust, slight disarrangement of their positions, but nothing as obvious as this hollow one. "And the book plates? Did you notice any that appeared to have been disturbed?" "Now that you mention it, yes. 3 or 4 volumes had plates that seemed to have been recently removed and reattached. The The paste was still slightly tacky, and the paper showed wrinkles where it had been repositioned. Lady Bantry sank into a chair, looking suddenly older. "I don't understand any of this. Why would someone go to such elaborate lengths to conceal tape and rings in my books? What possible purpose could it serve?" Miss Marple returned to the hollow volume, examining the interior more closely. The cuts that had created the compartment were precise and professional, made with proper tools and considerable skill. This was not the work of an amateur vandal, but of someone who understood both books and the techniques used to modify them. "The workmanship is quite expert," she observed. "Whoever created this hiding place knew exactly what they were doing. The edges are clean, the depth is uniform, and care was taken to preserve the spine and covers so that the book would appear normal when closed." She held up the torn bookplate fragment again, studying the paste smears with her magnifying glass. "This paste is identical to what we found on the mechanism books. Same texture, same wheat starch base, same degree of freshness. You're suggesting the same person was responsible for both?" Inspector Slack asked. "It seems likely, doesn't it? Someone who had access to wheat paste, who understood bookbinding techniques, and who needed to conceal certain items while maintaining the appearance that nothing had been disturbed." Skeffington cleared his throat diplomatically. "I hate to interrupt this fascinating analysis, but I really must collect my papers and return to London this evening. Unless there's something specific you need from me, Inspector." "Not at the moment," Slack replied, though his tone suggested that might change. "But don't go too far. We may have more questions as this investigation develops." After the architect had gathered his belongings and departed, Miss Marple sat quietly in the library, turning the coil of linen tape over in her hands. The material was of excellent quality, treated with just the right amount of starch to make it strong without becoming brittle. The brass ring was well made too, not some hastily improvised substitute, but a proper curtain ring that would slide smoothly and silently. "Someone planned this very carefully," she murmured to Inspector Slack. "The hollow book, the tape, the ring, the paste on the mechanism, even the disturbed book plates. This wasn't a spontaneous action, but a deliberate preparation." "Preparation for what?" Miss Marple's mild blue eyes grew thoughtful as she gazed at the secret bookcase, now standing open to reveal the narrow priest's hole beyond. In the late afternoon light, the small space looked innocent enough, just an historical curiosity with its three-legged stool and carved niche. But she was beginning to suspect that someone had found a way to make that harmless hiding place into something far more sinister. Someone who understood mechanisms and had access to the right materials. Someone who could work with professional precision and leave behind only the most subtle traces of their activities. The question was not just who, but how. And Miss Marple had a growing conviction that the linen tape and brass ring were going to provide the answer to both questions. Chapter 5. China Closet Panel. The discovery of the hollow book had cast a new light over the entire investigation, and Miss Marple found herself drawn back to the china closet with renewed purpose. The small room, with its glass-fronted cabinets and carefully arranged porcelain, had taken on an entirely different significance since the morning's revelations. Inspector Slack followed her with the reluctant air of a man who had hoped for a straightforward case of natural causes, but was beginning to suspect he would not be so fortunate. The afternoon light streaming through the china closet's single window illuminated every detail with crystalline clarity. "Now then," Miss Marple said, kneeling beside the disturbed panel behind the lower shelves, "let us see what story these screws have to tell." She examined each one carefully, noting how they lay scattered on the polished floor. They were old screws, their heads worn smooth by decades of occasional removal and replacement, but they gleamed with an unusual cleanliness. "These have been rubbed with soap," she observed, holding one up for the inspector's examination. "See how the threads slide smoothly through your fingers?" Someone wanted to ensure they could be turned without the slightest sound. Slack took the screw and tested it himself, his thick fingers detecting the telltale slickness that made the metal glide silently. "Professional work," he admitted grudgingly. "Whoever did this knew what they were about." Miss Marple moved to the panel itself, which hung at an awkward angle, revealing the dark space behind where pipes and wiring ran through the old house. The wood around the screw holes showed no signs of splintering or force. The panel had been removed with care and precision. Mrs. Hart mentioned that the plumbers had been working in here, she mused. But plumbers would have no need to soap their screws, would they? Their work is rarely concerned with absolute silence. She knelt on the floor and began a methodical examination of the area around the baseboard. Almost immediately her keen eyes spotted something that made her pause. "Inspector, would you be so kind as to bring that magnifying glass from the library?" While Slack fetched the glass, Miss Marple remained motionless beside her discovery. When he returned, she pointed to a small crumb of white powder that had lodged in the gap between the floorboard and the wall. "Whiting powder," she said with satisfaction, examining it through the lens. "The same substance we found on Mr. Vale's cuff, and in Mr. Simms's supplies." But it was her next discovery that proved even more significant. Caught on a rough edge of the baseboard was a short piece of thread, flat and lustrous, with the unmistakable sheen of starched linen. "Bookbinder's tape," she breathed, lifting it carefully with her handkerchief. "A fragment that has been rubbed until it gleams, as if it had been drawn repeatedly across this rough edge." The thread was barely an inch long, but it showed clear signs of friction damage along one side, creating a burnished surface that caught the light. One end was frayed, as if it had been torn from a longer piece under tension. Inspector Slack was beginning to look decidedly uncomfortable. "Miss Marple, are you suggesting that someone used this china closet as part of some elaborate scheme?" "I'm not suggesting anything definitive yet," she replied mildly. "But I think we should examine the ventilation grill more carefully." The small metal grill that connected the china closet to the priest's hole was set low in the wall, positioned so that air could circulate between the two spaces. Miss Marple knelt beside it and directed her magnifying glass at the metal bars. "Most illuminating," she murmured after several minutes of careful study. Two of the bars, positioned at precisely the height where a seated person's neck would be on the other side of the wall, showed clear evidence of recent polishing. The metal gleamed with a fresh brightness that contrasted sharply with the general patina of age on the surrounding metalwork. "Someone has been rubbing these bars with considerable force," she observed, "and recently too. The polish is still bright, not dulled by dust or time." She moved her examination to the floor directly in front of the grill, where her patient search revealed another significant clue. Pressed into the gap between two floorboards was a small piece of the same flat linen tape, this one showing even more pronounced signs of friction damage. "This piece has been under considerable tension," she noted, showing it to Inspector Slack. "See how the fibres are compressed and burnished? This tape has been pulled tight against those polished bars." The inspector studied the evidence with growing alarm. "You're building up quite a picture here, Miss Marple. But I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting." Miss Marple rose and dusted off her skirt, her mild blue eyes thoughtful as she gazed at the grill. "I think someone discovered a way to use this ventilation opening for purposes quite different from its original design. The soaped screws allowed silent access to this space. The polished bars suggest repeated friction from some sort of cord or tape, and the fragments we found indicate that considerable force was applied." She moved to examine the shelving above the disturbed panel, running her fingers along the edges until she found what she was looking for. On one shelf, at exactly the right height, was a square mark in the dust where something flat had been placed and recently removed. "A board of some sort stood here," she said, tracing the outline with her finger. "Large enough to cover the grill opening completely, cutting off air circulation between the two rooms." Inspector Slack was now paying very close attention indeed. "Are you saying someone could have controlled the ventilation between these rooms? Cut off the air to that priest's hole?" "It would seem possible," Miss Marple replied carefully. "A board placed over the grill would effectively seal the priest's hole, creating a closed chamber with very limited air supply." She returned to the grill once more, this time examining the edges where such a board might have been positioned. The metal frame showed slight scratches consistent with something being slid into place and later removed. "But that's not all," she continued, her voice taking on the gentle certainty that those who knew her recognized as particularly significant. Someone also found a way to use this grill for another purpose entirely. Those polished bars suggest that something was passed through the opening repeatedly, something that required considerable force and created substantial friction. The implications of her words hung in the air like a challenge to everything they had previously believed about Crispin Vale's death. The inspector found himself staring at the innocent-looking grill with new and distinctly uneasy feelings. "Miss Marple," he said heavily, "I think you'd better tell me exactly what you believe happened in these 2 rooms last night." But Miss Marple merely smiled her gentle smile and began gathering up the evidence they had collected. "Not yet, Inspector. There are still several questions that need answering first, but I think we can safely say that Mr. Vale's death was considerably more complicated than a simple heart attack in a stuffy room." Chapter 6. The Plan Tube Knot. Miss Marple's attention had been drawn to small details throughout the investigation, but it was during tea that afternoon when she noticed something that brought all her observations into sharp focus. Guy Skeffington had returned to collect a forgotten set of drawings, and as he prepared to secure his plan tube, she watched with the intense interest that had served her so well in previous cases. The architect's movements were precise and economical as he wound the leather strap around the cylindrical tube. But it was the way he tied the final knot that captured her attention completely. His fingers worked with automatic skill, creating a flat, neat reef knot with the ends tucked and flattened in a distinctive manner. "What an interesting way to tie that," she observed pleasantly. "So very neat and professional." Skeffington glanced up with mild surprise. "Oh, that. Force of habit, I'm afraid. We architects learn to secure our drawings properly. Papers have a way of escaping at the most inconvenient moments." "Indeed they do," Miss Marple agreed. "I've always admired people who can tie proper knots. So much more reliable than the casual bows most of us manage." She moved closer to examine his handiwork. The reef knot was perfectly balanced, with both ends lying flat against the tube and trimmed to exactly the same length. Everything about it spoke of long practice and professional training. "A reef knot, isn't it?" she inquired. "My late father was in the Navy, and he always insisted that there was a right way and a wrong way to tie every knot." "Quite correct," Skeffington replied with evident satisfaction. "A proper flat reef knot won't slip or come undone accidentally, unlike the granny knots most people tie without thinking." After he departed, Miss Marple found herself drawn back to the evidence they'd collected. She laid out the coil of linen tape from the hollow book, studying the knot that secured its end with renewed interest. "Inspector," she called softly, "I think you should see this." Slack joined her at the library table where she had arranged the various pieces of evidence. The linen tape coil was wound with professional precision, and the end was secured with a knot identical to the one she had just observed Skeffington tying on his plan tube. "The same flat reef knot," she murmured, comparing her memory of Skeffington's work with the evidence before them. "Ends tucked and flattened in exactly the same manner." She moved to examine other items in the room, seeking confirmation of her growing suspicion. Edgar Sim's work table yielded one comparison: several labels tied with his characteristic fussy bows, quite different from the architectural precision of the reef knot. "Mr. Sims favours a decorative approach," she observed, showing the inspector a ribbon bow that secured a bundle of repair materials. "Rather elaborate, wouldn't you say?" In the morning room, she found evidence of Yanthi Lacey's handiwork in a sewing basket that Lady Bantry had encouraged her to use. The young woman's preferred method was entirely different again, using tiny hemming knots that were barely visible to the naked eye. "Miss Lacey's work is quite exquisite," Miss Marple noted, examining a piece of embroidery. "These knots are so small and delicate, nothing at all like our linen tape securing." She returned to the library with growing certainty, her mind working through the implications of what she had discovered. The knot on the tape was not the result of random tying by someone unfamiliar with proper techniques. It was the work of a professional, someone who tied the same type of knot repeatedly until it became second nature. Inspector Slack was beginning to follow her reasoning. "You're saying Skeffington prepared that coil of tape?" "The evidence suggests it," Miss Marple replied carefully. "The knot is identical to his professional method, and the tape itself is bookbinder's linen of the sort used in restoration work. She paused beside the priest's hole entrance, her eyes thoughtful as she considered the spatial relationships between the various rooms. I've been wondering how someone could have controlled events from the china closet while maintaining the appearance that nothing unusual had occurred. What do you mean? Miss Marple moved to demonstrate, positioning herself at the entrance to the secret chamber. Consider the geometry, Inspector. Someone seated on that stool would be at exactly the right height for the ventilation grill, and someone in the china closet could reach through that grill quite easily. She gestured toward the evidence they'd collected. We have tape prepared with a professional knot, a brass ring to make it easier to manipulate, and clear signs of friction on the grill bars at neck height. The implications were becoming clearer, though she was not yet ready to voice them completely. The pattern of evidence suggested a method that was both ingenious and terrible in its calculation. But there's something else, she continued, returning to examine the tape coil once more. This preparation required considerable advance planning. The book had to be hollowed out properly, the tape prepared and tested, the china closet panel made accessible with soaped screws. She looked up at Inspector Slack with eyes that had lost all trace of their usual mildness. This was not a crime of passion or opportunity, Inspector. Someone spent considerable time preparing for exactly what happened last night. The revelation that afternoon came when Lady Bantry mentioned, almost casually, an incident from the previous day that had seemed insignificant at the time. Guy was showing us the proper way to secure architectural drawings, she said during their late tea. After lunch, when we were all gathered in the morning room, he demonstrated his knot-tying technique, explaining how important it was to get it exactly right. Miss Marple set down a teacup with particular care. He demonstrated his knot-tying. Oh yes, quite thoroughly. He was rather proud of his method, actually. Showed us how to make what he called a proper flat knot that wouldn't come undone. Said it was essential for any professional who dealt with important papers. The memory brought back another detail that had seemed unimportant until now. Miss Marple recalled how Skeffington had handled everything during the bookcase demonstration, with such assured familiarity, not just with the mechanism itself, but with the spatial relationships of the rooms. Lady Bantry, she said carefully, when did Mr. Skeffington first examine the priest's hole and the china closet? Was it recently, or had he been familiar with the layout for some time? Oh, he's known about the secret room since he began the restoration work weeks ago. He needed to understand all the structural details, you see. He spent considerable time studying the connections between the rooms, the ventilation system, all those technical matters that architects concern themselves with. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Weeks of preparation time, detailed knowledge of the room layouts, professional skills with knots and bindings, and access to all the necessary materials. The picture was becoming disturbingly complete, though one crucial element remained to be discovered. She was beginning to understand how the crime had been committed, but she still needed to establish why. And for that, she suspected, they would need to examine more carefully what Crispin Vale had been planning to write about his visit to Gossington Hall. Chapter 7, Bookplates and Borrowings. The search through Crispin Vale's personal effects had been postponed until the following morning, but Miss Marple's gentle insistence finally persuaded Inspector Slack that it might prove illuminating. The author's notebook found in his jacket pocket was a revelation that cast an entirely new light on the events of the previous evening. "Listen to this," Inspector Slack read aloud, his voice growing more grave with each entry. "Bantry Diary 1688, page missing. Monogram letter, B to R. Priest hole dimensions for authenticity check." Miss Marple studied the crude sketch that accompanied these notes. Vale had drawn the interior of the secret chamber with surprising accuracy, including details of the latch mechanism that could only have been observed during careful examination. He was researching more than hidden rooms, she observed quietly. These notes suggest he was investigating the authenticity of historical claims. The implications were troubling. Vale's reputation as a gossip columnist was well established, but this notebook revealed a more serious investigative purpose that might have threatened reputations in ways far beyond mere social embarrassment. "What's this about a missing diary page?" Slack demanded, showing the notebook to Lady Bantry, who had joined them in the library. Lady Bantry's face paled as she examined Vale's handwriting. "Oh dear! He must have been poking about in my morning-room desk. There's an old family diary there, 17th century, with some pages that have become loose over the years." "May we see it?" Miss Marple asked gently. In the morning-room, Lady Bantry unlocked a small writing desk with obvious reluctance. Inside, among various papers and correspondence, lay a leather-bound volume whose pages were yellowed with age. "It belonged to my husband's ancestor," she explained, "Lady Catherine Bantry, who lived through some rather dramatic times. Most of it is quite ordinary household accounts and social observations, but there are a few entries about the Civil War period that the family has always found rather embarrassing." Miss Marple opened the diary carefully, noting immediately that one page had been partially torn from its binding. The tear was old, but recent handling had disturbed the aged paper further. "This page has been removed and replaced recently," she observed, lifting the loose leaf. "See how the torn edge has fresh creases where it's been folded?" The diary entry, dated 1688, was written in faded brown ink that had survived the centuries remarkably well. Lady Catherine's account described hiding certain documents of a compromising nature during political troubles, and mentioned the priest's chamber behind the library books where dangerous secrets might rest safely. "Vale was researching whether your family's historical claims were genuine," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "But why would that matter enough to justify murder?" The answer came when they discovered what else had been disturbed in the morning-room. Under Lady Bantry's blotting paper, barely visible unless one looked carefully, was a faint impression of handwriting that had pressed through from the page above. Miss Marple held the blotter up to the light, revealing the ghostly outline of words that had been written and then removed. "Someone copied this diary entry," she announced, "and recently, judging by the freshness of the impression." Inspector Slack squinted at the faint markings. "Can you make out what it says?" "Fragments only," but enough to suggest that someone was preparing to expose not just the diary's contents, but perhaps to question their authenticity. They returned to Vale's notebook, studying his other entries with new understanding. The reference to monogram letter, B to R, was particularly intriguing, and Lady Bantry's reaction suggested she knew exactly what it meant. "There is a letter," she admitted reluctantly, "one of the family papers. It purports to be from Lady Catherine to someone with the initial R, describing how certain valuable items were hidden during the Troubles, but scholars have sometimes questioned whether it's genuine or a later fabrication." "And if Mr. Vale intended to publish doubts about its authenticity?" Miss Marple inquired. "It would be embarrassing, certainly. The letter has been cited in several historical works as evidence of the family's loyalty during difficult times. If it were proven to be a forgery..." Miss Marple was beginning to understand the scope of Vale's investigations and why they might have posed a serious threat. A gossip columnist who could prove that respected historical documents were fabrications would have considerable power over those whose reputations depended on those documents. But there was more. As they continued examining the desk, Yanthy Lacey made a discovery that added another dimension to the case. "Lady Bantry," the young woman said hesitantly, "I think someone has been through your correspondence as well. The letters in the desk had been carefully replaced, but not quite in their original order. Someone with a thorough knowledge of the desk's contents had searched through private papers and attempted to conceal their intrusion." "What were they looking for?" Inspector Slack demanded. Miss Marple was studying Vale's notebook again, focusing on entries that had seemed insignificant before. "Modern correspondence," she said suddenly. "Look at this notation. Recent contracts, restoration work, authenticity guarantees." The implication was chilling. Vale had not been content to investigate historical documents. He had been researching contemporary claims about restoration work, perhaps questioning whether modern discoveries were genuine or had been planted to enhance the reputation of certain professionals. "Guy Skeffington's work," Lady Bantry whispered, understanding immediately. If Vale intended to suggest that Guy had been enhancing his discoveries, "It would ruin him professionally," Miss Marple agreed. An architect whose reputation depends on authentic historical discoveries would be destroyed by allegations of fabrication. She moved to the window, her mind working through the connections between Vale's research and the elaborate preparation that had preceded his death. The motive was becoming clear, but it was far more complex than simple embarrassment over old family papers. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I think we need to examine Mr. Skeffington's other restoration projects. If Mr. Vale had discovered a pattern of questionable authenticity claims—" The telephone rang at that moment and Edgar Sims answered it in the hallway. His voice carried clearly as he spoke to the caller. "I'm sorry, sir, but Mr. Skeffington is not available." "There's been an incident." "Yes, sir, quite serious." "No, sir, I don't know when the library work will be completed." Miss Marple exchanged glances with Inspector Slack. The outside world was beginning to take notice of events at Gossington Hall, and that could only increase the pressure on everyone involved. "The contracts Vale mentioned," she said thoughtfully. "I wonder if we might discover that Mr. Skeffington's recent successes have depended rather heavily on convenient historical discoveries, and if Mr. Vale intended to publish his suspicions—" She did not need to finish the sentence. They all understood now what had been at stake. Skeffington's professional reputation, his future contracts, perhaps his entire career had hung in the balance. For a man who had spent years building a reputation as a skilled and honest restorer, the threat of exposure as a fraud would have been devastating. "But surely," Lady Bantry protested, "even if Guy had been taking liberties with historical accuracy, that wouldn't justify—" "Murder," Miss Marple finished gently. "No, indeed it wouldn't. But people have killed for far less significant threats to their livelihood and reputation." She closed Vale's notebook with a decisive snap. The motive was now clear, and the method was becoming increasingly evident. What remained was to demonstrate exactly how Guy Skeffington had used his knowledge of the house's layout and his professional skills to commit what had initially appeared to be an impossible crime. "Inspector," she said with quiet authority, "I believe it's time we had another conversation with Mr. Skeffington, and this time we should be prepared with some very specific questions about his recent restoration discoveries." Chapter 8. The Vent That Didn't Breathe. Dr. Haydock's return visit that morning brought with it a revelation that transformed the entire investigation. The elderly physician had been troubled by certain aspects of his initial examination, and a night's reflection had prompted him to reconsider his hasty diagnosis. "I've been thinking about poor Vale," he announced without preamble, as he joined Miss Marple and Inspector Slack in the library. "Something about the condition of his lungs has been nagging at me." He settled his medical bag on the table with the deliberate movements of a man who had made countless such examinations over his long career. "I said heart failure yesterday, and I suppose that's technically accurate. But the underlying cause may have been quite different from what I initially assumed." Miss Marple looked up from her contemplation of the priest's hole entrance with immediate interest. "In what way, Doctor?" "The congestion I observed in his lungs," Haydock explained, pulling out his notes from the previous evening. "At the time I attributed it to the excitement and poor ventilation, but on reflection, the pattern is more consistent with what one might expect to see in cases of strangulation." Inspector Slack's head jerked up sharply. "Strangulation?" But there wasn't a mark on the man's neck. "Precisely what's so puzzling," Haydock agreed. "No external bruising, no finger marks, no rope burns or ligature impressions. Yet the internal evidence suggests that his air supply was severely restricted before death occurred." Miss Marple rose and moved to the ventilation grill that connected the priest's hole to the china closet. "Doctor, would you say the restriction was gradual or sudden?" "Gradual, I should think. The sort of slow compression that might occur if someone were being slowly strangled with something that distributed the pressure evenly, something that wouldn't leave obvious marks." She knelt beside the grill and beckoned the others to join her. "I've been conducting a small experiment with this ventilation system," she announced. "Lady Bantry, would you be so kind as to assist me from the china closet?" When Lady Bantry was positioned in the adjoining room, Miss Marple called out instructions. "Now, if you would open and close the door several times, while I hold this feather near the grill." The feather remained perfectly motionless despite the movement of air that should have been created by the door's motion. Miss Marple tried the experiment from several different positions, but the result was always the same. No air movement whatsoever, she observed. Yet this grill was designed to provide ventilation between the rooms. Something is preventing the normal flow of air. She directed their attention to the china closet side of the grill, where her careful examination the previous day had revealed the telltale square of polish on the shelf edge. A board was placed here, she demonstrated, showing how a flat piece of wood could completely seal the opening. When the grill was blocked, the priest's hole became a sealed chamber with no source of fresh air. Dr. Haydock nodded grimly. That would certainly account for the respiratory distress, but it still doesn't explain the specific pattern of lung congestion I observed. Miss Marple returned to the priest's hole itself, studying the small space with renewed attention. The three-legged stool sat in the centre, positioned so that someone seated upon it would be directly facing the carved niche in the far wall. "The candle," she said suddenly, pointing to the stub of wax that still lay on the floor. "Dr. Haydock, you mentioned yesterday that it had burned out, but look at the wick." She held up the candle remains for examination. The wick was clean and relatively long, not burned down to nothing as one would expect from a candle that had consumed all its available fuel. "It was extinguished while still capable of burning," she observed, "and look here, at the base of the niche where it was placed." The carved stone showed no trace of soot or smoke staining, despite being in the direct path of any smoke the candle might have produced. Miss Marple held the stub near the grill opening and struck a match to relight it. The flame flickered momentarily, then went out almost immediately, despite the absence of any apparent draught. "The air in this chamber is already depleted," she announced. "Even now, hours after Mr. Vale's death, there isn't sufficient oxygen to maintain a flame." Inspector Slack was beginning to look distinctly uncomfortable. "Are you saying someone deliberately suffocated him by sealing off the ventilation?" "That may have been part of the method," Miss Marple agreed carefully. "But I suspect there was more to it than simple suffocation." She moved back to examine the grill bars once more, paying particular attention to the two that showed signs of recent polishing. "These bars are positioned at exactly the right height for someone seated on that stool, and the polishing suggests repeated friction from something being drawn across them." She looked up at Dr. Haydock with eyes that had lost all trace of their usual mildness. "Doctor, if someone were to be strangled with something flat and smooth, something that distributed pressure evenly across the throat, would that account for the lack of external marking?" "It might," he admitted reluctantly. "A wide, flat ligature could compress the airway without leaving obvious bruising, particularly if it were drawn tight gradually, rather than applied with sudden force." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And if such a ligature were made of treated linen, starched and burnished until it was as smooth as silk?" The implications hung in the air like a challenge to everything they had previously believed possible. Inspector Slack found himself staring at the innocent-looking grill with new and very different eyes. "But how could someone strangle a man through a ventilation grill?" he demanded. "It's impossible." "Is it?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Consider the geometry, Inspector. Someone seated on that stool would be positioned perfectly for the grill opening, and someone in the china closet could easily pass something through the bars." She held up the coil of linen tape they had found in the hollow book. "This tape is long enough to pass through the grill, form a loop around someone's neck, and still leave sufficient length for control from the other side of the wall." Dr. Haydock was examining the tape with professional interest. "The material is certainly smooth enough to avoid leaving marks, and if it were drawn tight gradually, the victim might not even realize what was happening until it was too late," Miss Marple finished quietly, "particularly if the room had already been sealed to create oxygen deprivation and confusion." She moved to demonstrate her theory, though she was careful not to actually recreate the deadly mechanism. The brass ring would make it possible to manipulate the tape through the narrow opening. A loop passed through the grill, positioned around the victim's throat as he bent forward to examine something in the niche, then drawn tight from the safety of the adjacent room. The picture she painted was both ingenious and horrible in its calculated precision. Inspector Slack found himself imagining the scene. Vale seated in the narrow chamber, perhaps already feeling the effects of oxygen deprivation, bending forward to measure the carved niche, while an unseen killer prepared to strike from the safety of the china closet. The polished bars would allow the tape to slide smoothly, Miss Marple continued, her voice matter-of-fact despite the grim subject matter. No catching or snagging to alert the victim. And once the deed was accomplished, the tape could be withdrawn through the grille, the ventilation unblocked, and the room restored to its normal appearance. Dr. Haydock shook his head in reluctant admiration for the method's terrible efficiency. It would leave virtually no trace, no weapon to be found, no obvious signs of violence, no way for the victim to call for help or defend himself. Miss Marple nodded gravely. And the spring-loaded latch would ensure that the death chamber remained sealed until someone chose to open it from the outside, creating the perfect illusion of death by natural causes in a room that could only be opened by someone else. The priest's hole, with its centuries-old purpose of concealment and protection, had been transformed into something far more sinister by someone who understood both its mechanisms and its possibilities. Chapter 9. Fibres on the Skirting. The morning had brought with it a crisp clarity that seemed to illuminate every detail of the case with merciless precision. Miss Marple stood once again beside the library skirting where she had first discovered those telltale pale fibres, her magnifying glass revealing secrets that had been hidden in plain sight. "Inspector Slack," she called softly, "I believe these fibres deserve another examination." The 2 strands of material she'd found caught on the baseboard were barely visible to the naked eye, but under magnification they revealed a story that confirmed her growing understanding of the crime's methodology. "Bookbinder's linen," she observed, holding the fibres up to the light, "flat, starched and treated until it gleams. But notice the way the individual strands have been compressed and polished on one edge." Inspector Slack squinted at the minute evidence. "What does that signify?" "Friction," Miss Marple replied simply. "These fibres have been rubbed repeatedly against something rough and sharp. Something like the edge of this skirting board, perhaps, or the metal bars of a ventilation grille." She moved to demonstrate, showing how a length of tape drawn tight under tension would naturally catch and fray against any rough surface it encountered. When the tape was withdrawn after serving its deadly purpose, these fragments were left behind as evidence of its passage. Dr. Haydock, who had remained to observe the final stages of the investigation, leaned forward with professional interest. "And you believe this supports your theory about the method of murder?" "More than supports it, I'm afraid," Miss Marple replied gravely. "It proves it." She led them to where Crispin Vale's jacket still hung, awaiting collection by the undertaker. With careful fingers she turned back the collar to reveal the inner fabric that had been pressed against his neck during his final moments. "Look closely at this area, just inside the collar line," she instructed, directing their attention to a faint mark that was barely visible against the dark fabric. Under her magnifying glass, the mark resolved into a thin line of polish, the kind that results when something smooth and slightly waxy is drawn repeatedly across cloth under pressure. "Thread polish," she announced with quiet satisfaction. "The same burnished sheen we found on those grill bars and on the fibres by the skirting board. Mr. Vale's collar shows clear evidence that something flat and polished was drawn tight around his throat." The implications were undeniable. Inspector Slack found himself staring at evidence that transformed what had appeared to be a death by natural causes into something far more sinister. "But surely," he protested, though his voice lacked conviction, "there would have been more obvious signs of struggle." "Not if the victim was already weakened by oxygen deprivation," Dr. Haydock interjected grimly, "and not if the ligature was applied gradually, perhaps while he was focused on some other task." Miss Marple nodded agreement. "Consider Mr. Vale's position when we found him. Slumped forward over that stool, as if he had been leaning toward the niche to examine something when death occurred. The perfect position for someone to slip a loop around his neck from behind." She moved to her evidence collection, spreading out the various items they had discovered: the hollow book, the coil of linen tape, the brass ring, the disturbed book plates, and the fragments of matching material found at multiple locations. "The pattern is quite clear," she observed. "Someone prepared extensively for this crime, gathering the necessary materials and ensuring they could be concealed until needed. The hollow book provided storage for the murder weapon. The soap screws allowed silent access to the china closet, and the polished grille bars ensured smooth operation of the deadly mechanism." Inspector Slack was examining Guy Skeffington's architectural satchel, which had been left behind during his hasty departure the previous evening. Inside, he found items that provided the final confirmation of Miss Marple's theory. "Small pot of paste," he read from his inventory, "whiting powder, bookbinder's linen tape still in its wrapper, and—" He paused, his expression growing grim. "A torn piece of paper that matches the wrapper we found around the hollow book." Miss Marple examined the wrapper fragment with interest. "Bookbinder's linen hinge tape," she read from the printed label. "Professional grade, starched and treated for restoration work. Exactly what we would expect an architect engaged in historical restoration to carry." The evidence was mounting into an overwhelming case against Skeffington, but Miss Marple was not yet finished. She had one more crucial element to demonstrate. "The timing is particularly significant," she observed, consulting her notes from the previous evening. "Mr. Skeffington claimed to have been in the smoking room with Edgar Sims during the critical period, but Mr. Sims, when pressed, admitted to stepping out for 5 minutes around 10 o'clock. Edgar Sims, who had been hovering anxiously in the background, shifted uncomfortably under their scrutiny. "I had to attend to the back stairs, miss. One of the servants reported a loose banister that needed immediate attention." 5 minutes, Miss Marple mused. Quite sufficient time for someone familiar with the house layout to slip into the china closet, seal the ventilation grill, and prepare for murder. She turned to Inspector Slack with eyes that had lost all trace of their usual gentleness. "I believe, Inspector, that we have sufficient evidence to warrant a very serious conversation with Mr. Skeffington. The physical evidence, the means, the opportunity, and most importantly the motive are all clearly established." The motive, indeed, had become the most compelling aspect of the entire case. Crispin Vale's research had threatened not just embarrassment, but complete professional ruin for a man whose reputation depended entirely on his integrity as a historical restorer. "When did you first suspect him?" Inspector Slack asked as they prepared to locate the architect. Miss Marple considered the question carefully. "The paste on the mechanism books was suggestive from the beginning," she replied. "But it was the knot on that linen tape that convinced me we were dealing with someone who tied the same type of knot repeatedly until it became automatic. Professional habits are very difficult to conceal." She paused beside the priest's hole entrance one final time, her expression sad as she contemplated how a place designed for sanctuary had been transformed into a death trap. "Mr. Skeffington understood this house better than anyone," she continued. "He knew the layout, the ventilation system, the mechanical operations of the secret room. He had weeks to plan and prepare, access to all the necessary materials and the professional skills to carry out his scheme with precision." Dr. Haydock shook his head in reluctant admiration for the method's terrible ingenuity. "It very nearly worked, if not for your attention to those small details." "Small details often reveal large truths," Miss Marple replied simply. "And in this case, the fibres on the skirting, the polish on a dead man's collar, and the knot that secured a coil of tape have combined to expose a very carefully planned murder." Inspector Slack was already reaching for his telephone to summon assistance. Guy Skeffington's architectural precision had served him well in planning the crime, but it was that same attention to detail that had ultimately provided the evidence for his conviction. The case was drawing to its inevitable conclusion, but Miss Marple knew that the final confrontation would require careful handling. Cornered criminals could be dangerous, and Skeffington had already demonstrated his capacity for cold-blooded calculation. Chapter 10. Library. The loop through the grill. The confrontation, when it came, took place in the very room where the crime had been committed. Guy Skeffington arrived at Gossington Hall that afternoon with his usual air of professional competence. But Miss Marple noticed immediately that his customary precision showed signs of strain. His architectural portfolio was not quite as neatly arranged as usual, and there was a tension in his movements that spoke of a man under considerable pressure. "I understand you wish to see me again, Inspector," he said, as he entered the library where the assembled company waited. "I do hope we can conclude this business quickly. I have several pressing appointments in London." Inspector Slack gestured toward a chair with grim courtesy. "I think you'll find this conversation rather more involved than you might expect, Mr. Skeffington." Miss Marple rose from her position beside the bookcase mechanism, her mild blue eyes holding an expression that those who knew her well would have recognized as particularly dangerous. "Before we begin," she said pleasantly, "I wonder if you might demonstrate the bookcase mechanism once more, just to refresh our memories of how it operates." Skeffington's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Miss Marple caught it. "Surely that's hardly necessary at this point." "Oh, but I think it is," she replied with gentle insistence. "You see, we've discovered some rather interesting things about how this mechanism was used on the night Mr. Vale died." With obvious reluctance, Skeffington moved to the bookcase and performed the familiar ritual. His hands were steady as he tilted Lives of the Saints, Volume 7, and pressed the hidden spring behind Plutarch, but Miss Marple noticed that he avoided looking directly at the books he handled. "Most expertly done," she observed as the secret door swung open. "But I notice you were careful not to touch the top edges of those volumes. Most wise, considering the paste residue they still carry." Skeffington's face remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened slightly where he gripped his portfolio. "Now," Miss Marple continued, moving to the evidence table where all their discoveries were laid out with methodical precision, "let me tell you what we believe happened on the night Mr. Vale died." She gestured toward the coil of linen tape, the brass ring, and the fragments of matching material they had collected. "The preparation began weeks ago, didn't it, Mr. Skeffington? When you realized that Mr. Vale's research was going to expose your methods of enhancing historical discoveries—" "I'm afraid I don't understand what you're suggesting," Skeffington replied, but his voice lacked its usual confident ring. "Oh, I think you understand perfectly," Miss Marple said gently. "Mr. Vale had discovered that your reputation for finding authentic historical artifacts was based on a rather different sort of authenticity than your clients believed. He intended to publish his findings, didn't he? Along with some rather damaging speculation about your professional methods." She moved to the hollow book they had discovered, opening it to reveal the compartment that had concealed the murder weapon. "You prepared this hiding place carefully, using your professional bookbinding skills to create a storage space that would escape casual notice. The wheat paste, the precise cuts, the attention to preserving the book's external appearance, all speak of expert craftsmanship." Inspector Slack took up the narrative, his voice heavy with certainty. "You had access to the china closet through your restoration work. You soaped the screws on that panel to ensure you could work silently. You studied the ventilation system until you understood exactly how it could be manipulated. The method itself was ingenious," Miss Marple continued, her tone almost admiring despite the grim subject matter. "First, you lured Mr. Vale into the priest's hole with his eagerness to examine the space for his research. Then, working from the china closet, you sealed the ventilation grill with a board, cutting off his air supply and ensuring he would be weakened and confused." She held up the coil of linen tape, its professional knot clearly visible. "This tape, prepared with your characteristic reef knot, was passed through the grill opening. The brass ring made it possible to manipulate the loop with precision, settling it around Mr. Vale's throat as he bent forward to examine the carved niche." Dr. Haydock stepped forward, his medical expertise lending weight to the accusation. "The gradual tightening of a flat, smooth ligature would account for the lung congestion I observed, while leaving no external marks of violence. A most calculated method of murder." Skeffington's facade of professional calm was beginning to crack. "This is all speculation. You have no proof of any of these wild allegations." "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied quietly, "we have considerable proof." She moved to display the evidence systematically, the paste on the mechanism books that matched his supplies. the fibres on the skirting board that corresponded to his bookbinder's tape, the thread polish on Vale's collar that showed how the ligature had been applied. Your own materials betrayed you, she continued, the wheat paste from your kit, the professional-grade linen tape from your restoration supplies, even the distinctive way you tie your knots. Professional habits, Mr. Skeffington, are very difficult to conceal. Inspector Slack produced the architect's satchel, displaying its contents with grim satisfaction. Still carrying the evidence, I see. Paste, whiting, and the wrapper from the tape you used to strangle Mr. Vale. But most damning of all, Miss Marple said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that commanded absolute attention, is your knowledge of timing and opportunity. You knew Edgar Sims would step away from the smoking room at precisely 10 o'clock to check the back stairs. You had arranged that distraction yourself, hadn't you? A loose banister that required immediate attention. Edgar Sims nodded reluctantly. He mentioned it to me after dinner, sir. Said he'd noticed it during his inspection, and thought I should attend to it promptly. The web of evidence was closing around Skeffington with inexorable precision. Miss Marple continued her reconstruction, each detail falling into place with devastating accuracy. 5 minutes was all you needed. Slip into the china closet, seal the grill, pass the tape through the opening, and wait for Mr. Vale to position himself properly. Once the deed was done, you withdrew the tape, removed the board from the grill to restore normal ventilation, and returned to the smoking room before Edgar came back. The spring latch ensured that the priest's hole remained sealed until discovered, Inspector Slack added, creating the perfect illusion of death by natural causes in a room that could only be opened from outside. Skeffington stood silent for a long moment, his architect's mind perhaps calculating the strength of the case against him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weariness of a man whose careful plans had been systematically demolished. Vale would have destroyed everything, he said quietly. Years of work, reputation built through genuine skill and dedication. He intended to suggest that every discovery I'd made was fabricated, every historical artifact I'd found was planted evidence. Was it? Miss Marple asked gently. Skeffington's silence was answer enough. The man who had built his career on claims of historical authenticity could not bring himself to voice the truth about his methods. Inspector Slack moved forward with official authority. Guy Skeffington, I'm arresting you for the murder of Crispin Vale. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Lady Bantry sank into a chair with visible relief. Thank heavens you kept my silly old diary out of the papers, Jane. Though I suppose none of that matters now. Later, as they watched Inspector Slack's car disappear down the drive with its prisoner, Lady Bantry stood beside Miss Marple in the library doorway. Secret rooms make one feel so romantic, she sighed, until they don't. Miss Marple folded her knitting with characteristic precision. Hiding places, my dear, are very like people's consciences. Useful in danger, and sometimes most dangerous of all. The bookcase stood open still, revealing the narrow chamber where death had masqueraded as natural causes. But the priest's hole had given up its secrets at last, and justice would be served for the man who had died within its ancient walls.